When a state establishes an endowment fund for the benefit of all of its citizens, this is what's typically known as a sovereign wealth fund. The first sovereign wealth fund was created by the Kuwaiti government in 1953 as a vehicle for investing the country's excess oil revenues into projects whose profits would ultimately fund the economy's economic diversification over decades to come and ultimately provide stability in the age after oil. Now, wealth funds in many countries are often confused with the reserves held by central banks. But this is important to distinguish between the two because currency reserves at central banks are generally held for short-term stabilization purposes, while sovereign wealth funds are generally to generate long-term income and are vehicles for engaging in strategic investments. Now, the concept is fairly widely used, particularly by resource exporters, but not exclusively so. Whether we're looking at Saudi Arabia or Micronesia, these kinds of funds have built up a total asset base of approximately $8 trillion, making them major players in some of the world's markets and driving a number of investments around the world, ultimately for the benefit of their sponsoring states. Now, unlike a traditional sort of endowment, the way that a sovereign wealth fund is managed is often not at full arm's length from their government, meaning, of course, that such endowments often make portfolio allocations in order to support strategic or political investments that a particular country might be interested in. Because the long-term and short-term goals of governments often involve a number of challenging priorities, it's difficult for us to generalize what the investment objectives of a sovereign wealth fund should be. Nonetheless, it is generally regarded that governments should try to avoid using sovereign wealth funds effectively as slush funds that can be dipped into whenever short-term needs arise. This has been the particular problem with the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, which was established decades ago to help Alberta to build up its own savings. In Canada, the provinces have ownership of their natural resources, meaning that Alberta was ultimately the beneficiary of Alberta's oil. In order to safeguard this natural wealth for future generations, the Heritage Savings Trust Fund was established. However, governments have consistently dipped into this fund such that it has been largely depleted over the years in an effort to maintain balanced budgets at the provincial level without regard for any of the needs of future generations who might have benefited from investments in their collective environmental endowments. Now, one of the biggest problems that sovereign wealth funds run into is that their governance systems are generally opaque. In fact, China's sovereign wealth fund, the China Investment Corporation, has deemed that its portfolio allocation is in fact a state secret, making it illegal for anyone to reveal what the CIC has necessarily invested in. And so as a result, there are concerns among a number of other potentially host governments about exactly what other countries' sovereign wealth funds might be investing in. This was the case with the United States and Dubai Ports World. In the early parts of the 2000s, several port assets in America came up for new management, and Dubai Ports World had bid on taking over the administration of these particular assets. Unfortunately for DP World, they ran into challenges from the United States where various members of the government found that it was politically sensitive to start handing over control of key strategic resources within the United States to foreign governments. And as a result, DP World was forced to ultimately withdraw its efforts to gain administration over these port assets. But because of the importance of sovereign wealth funds around the world and their continuing growth throughout the 21st century, it's ultimately going to become important for us to establish sort of rules of the road for how governments will treat one another, and in particular, how to make investments with these kinds of sovereign wealth funds in a way that will safeguard the interests of future generations while also ensuring a sense of security for potential investment targets. To that end, the IMF has established what they call the Santiago Principles, which should help provide some guidance on best practices to various governments who are hoping to set up endowment funds for the benefit of their people and future generations of their country.